All right, welcome back, everyone. This is our third installment in the series on creating and playing characters using the Pathfinder 2e system in Foundry VTT. So, over the last two videos, we've created a character, in our case, a third level wizard. We've outfitted them with everything they need. As you can see, the sheet has been completely filled, they're ready for action. And that is exactly what we're going to start to do now. We're going to send them into some action. So to begin with, I want to just guide you around some of the UI centered around your token. So when you mouse over it, oftentimes you'll see that this bar pops up along with the name of your character. It may not, depending on the settings of your GM, but I'll actually show you how to change that as well. So if we right click on our token, a bunch of options pop up. So I'm going to go through them one by one, just explain what you're looking at. So in the top left, this is an indication of elevation. So you can change this number to indicate that your character is above ground. And as it stands right now, if I indicate that it's below ground, she actually disappears. She actually goes below the space of the battle map. So effectively, she's hidden because she's underground here. In most cases, in my experience, you'll be dealing with positive elevation as opposed to negative elevation, but something to keep in mind. Very useful for tracking flying and the distances between creatures in the vertical plane as well. The gear right below it is going to bring up our token configuration settings. So here we see our token name, the settings for when the name should be displayed and how it should be displayed, which we can adjust. So currently I have it that when it's hovered, this information appears, but I can change that to any of the options here, including it always being visible or it never being visible. There are a couple of other things here, such as the image path for the token, opacity, things like that. I won't go through everything, but there's a bunch of stuff here for you to look at if you are interested. The third item on the left here is the targeting toggle. So you're almost never going to be using this because there are way more convenient ways to target than going to token config and targeting. And it's rare that you'll actually be targeting yourself for stuff. Usually targeting applies to other creatures that you want to affect in some way. But it's here in case you need it. The first item on the right here is going to be quite important. So this is all about our status effects. Now, as you know, Pathfinder 2e has a bunch of conditions, and this is how we can track them on our character. So they go alphabetically left to right, top to bottom, and they have these icons. So admittedly, some of the icons are not completely intuitive as to what they are, like this heart means petrified and that kind of thing, but you definitely get used to it. Your GM can also adjust the style of icon here. I believe in addition to these colored icons, they have black and white icons if that's more your speed. But that is something that the GM adjusts on a server-wide basis. And so if I want to put a condition on myself, for example, suppose I'm enfeebled. If I left click, enfeebled applies. And all of this is automated. So anything associated with strength will take that penalty as you would expect with enfeebled. So for example, if I click on the athletics button to roll it, you will see in this chat card, it indicates enfeebled 1. And you can very easily modify the numerical value of your conditions. So there's two ways to do that. One is by going in the conditions menu as we were before and just left clicking again to increase the condition, right clicking to reduce the condition. But actually, once we have this condition on our character, we don't even need to go into that menu. We can just go to the top right you see here, and left clicking and right clicking does the same thing. You can also do this to completely remove a condition. This applies to conditions, as we've just seen, but also, as we'll see a bit later, to effects, things that might have expired on you. Maybe you had Inspire Courage on you and it expired, so you want to toggle that off. All of that stuff will be in this top right corner as well. So below the status effect manager on the token config display here, we have the toggle combat state icon. So this actually lets you put your own character into initiative, into combat. And I'm not going to go into that right now, but we will be going into that in much more depth in just a little bit. Before we get to that, though, I wanted to just demonstrate movement a little bit. So movement in Foundry is pretty simple. You can drag and drop, as you might expect. This will encounter some errors if you're trying to go through walls. For instance, if I go all the way here and I try to drag myself over, it's not going to let me because the token movement collides with at least one wall. But in general, you can rely on this. You could also use either the arrow keys to move or the WASD keys to move as well. Those are the standard, the vanilla ways of moving, but there is one way that I'd like to highlight that can be very useful. So while selecting your token, so I've just left-clicked it once, I'm not holding it down, my token is selected. I'm going to hold down Control. I'm going to drag from my token to an adjacent square and then release the left click. And you'll see that this ruler kind of remains. So firstly, even just as it is right now, this is a very useful way of gauging distance. It's kind of like a shortcut to bring up the ruler tool that Foundry has, right? But it can also be used to establish waypoints for movement. So let me show you how that's going to go. So if I single left click now, I've established a waypoint. And I can continue to do this to establish a path of movement. So once I'm done with that path, I know that this is where I want to end my movement. I am going to release Control, and I'm going to hit the space bar, and my token will move along the prescribed path to the destination. So this can be very useful in a number of ways. You can gauge how far you're moving, so you know you're not going to move further than your speed, and you will show the GM and all the other players the exact path you're taking to move, which might be relevant in the combat encounter for all manner of reasons. Okay, that said, let's move right up to the door here, and you can see there is this little door icon. On Foundry, the doors are toggleable. You can activate them as a player, as long as the GM hasn't set it to locked or hidden or some other setting like that. This door is definitely openable, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that icon to open it. And oh no, it looks like something lurks beyond in the darkness. Now, it clearly means us no good. So with the help of the DM, we are going to go into a combat encounter here. So often, how this will work is the GM will start the combat encounter on their end, and then we can manually add ourselves to it, or the GM might have already added us to it. But I'm going to show you how to add yourself manually in case the GM decides to let the players do that job. All right, so what we need to do is we need to go to the combat tab over here, these cross swords you see on the right-hand side, and here is our encounter. So we're going to right-click our character, we're going to click toggle combat state as we had before, and we will now appear in this tab with the dice icon next to us. Now, Foundry has many ways of rolling initiative. I could just click this button to roll initiative, or I could, opening my character sheet, you see on the left hand side on this red banner, there is initiative, and I could just click to roll that. And by default, initiative is set to perception, but from this drop-down menu, you can actually set it to any skill. So this is usually up to the GM's discretion, but maybe if you're barging the door down or something like that, maybe your GM would allow you to roll initiative with athletics, in which case you just select athletics from there, and then whether you click the little roll icon here, or you click the roll icon from the initiative tracker, both of them will roll athletics for you. And I'll also show you a third way of rolling initiative, rolling non-standard initiative mostly, and that is by making a skill check. So let's start with that. Let's say somehow maybe our deity gave us some sort of a premonition of danger. Maybe we were hunting for that sort of unnatural energy and we found it. So let's say I'm rolling religion for initiative. My GM has given me permission. So I roll a religion check, and you can see that down here there is the chat card that shows us our result. And there's also this button, this crossed swords button here. If I click that button, my initiative is set to the total for that skill. So that's another way to do it, especially useful for things like avoiding notice, where you might have rolled your stealth check previously, and that's the stealth check that you're using when initiative breaks out. So you just find the chat card that you used to roll stealth, and you can just click these cross swords, and it will use that as your initiative for this combat encounter. Okay, now the GM has started combat. And as it happens, we can go first, as you can see on the initiative tracker here. So let's talk about how to do stuff in combat. So one of the most standard things is you probably want to make a strike of some sort. So what I can do, and here I'm going to demonstrate one of the most key principles of combat in Foundry, and that is targeting. So to target a creature, there are two main ways to do it. You can double right click the token to target it. You can see normally you wouldn't be able to see the token config of tokens you don't have ownership to, but by double right clicking, you can still target them. So that's one way to do it. If you double right click again, it will untarget them. But the much more easy way is just hover over the token and hit T. T is a default keybind for targeting. Now we'll go talk a bit more about keybinds a little bit later, but for now, T for target. Very easy to remember and very convenient. So generally, whenever you're affecting a creature other than yourself, and in some cases even yourself, really you want to always target. The system has a bunch of inbuilt logic in it that lets it become aware of who you're targeting and modify what you're doing to take into account factors that might be important. This can range for everything from damage to bonuses to hit if it realizes the enemy meets certain conditions, all that good stuff. I would just recommend you always remember to target. And the system will actually give you a message saying, please remember to target if you roll an attack roll without targeting. So first step done, we have targeted our enemy, and now we want to roll. So from our character sheet, let's see what we have. In our inventory, our actions tab, I should say, we have a crossbow here. So let's say that since we were exploring a dungeon, we probably would have had it drawn anyway, so it would be out already. All right, with our crossbow out, we might want to strike, but I would actually point you towards this little drop-down menu that says no ammo. So if I try to strike, you'll see what's going to happen. I'm going to get this message saying no ammunition is assigned to the crossbow. So I have actually bought some bolts. Drag that over from the equipment compendium as you've seen before. What we need to do is assign the bolts to the crossbow. And we do this because the system actually automatically tracks ammunition. So when I strike, I'm going to click strike here. I roll and the bolts are depleted. So you don't need to keep track of that yourself. The system takes care of that, which is very convenient. This chat card popped out and it shows everything that went into the roll, as we've seen before with things like athletics. It has all the traits of the attack, and it gives me my total and the result. Now, by default, Foundry will tell players the result of their attack, but or the result of an enemy's failed saving throw, or that kind of thing, but it won't tell them the exact numbers. So it's kind of the same as like the GM just saying you hit, but the GM isn't going to tell you you hit by 6 most often. I just want to point out that it is exactly the same process for spell attacks. If I wanted to, for example, cast the Acid Splash cantrip, I would, as we've seen in previous videos, click the cast button to bring up the spell card, and I would click attack over here on the chat card, and voila. All right, now this is still our turn, but so for ease, I'm going to actually roll damage and then show you how to apply damage to yourself. It'll be the GM's job to apply damage to their creatures, but I'm going to show it how it might be for you if, for example, you were the one getting hit with this crossbow. So firstly, to roll damage, I just click this handy card that popped up when I attacked. I can alternatively click the damage button from the actions tab of our character sheet. And now that the damage card is out, I want to, while selecting my token, if I click the damage button, it will automatically apply. So there's no need to do mental math in your head. 32 minus 7, what is that? You just click the button. It's all taken care of. for you. The chat card also has some helpful things for halving and doubling damage, useful for, saving throws and that kind of thing. Basic saving throws often have halving and doubling as part of it. There is even a block option, which is very useful for shield users because that automatically takes into account, it looks at what your shield's hardness is, it reduces the damage by that, and it applies the rest of the damage to both you and your shield. This is all taken care of in the system, so that's very useful for shield users. And of course there's heal, in case this actually wasn't damaging, but perhaps it was a positive energy emanation. You can just click that to heal right back up. Now sometimes you might be taking this damage, but maybe you're not taking all of it. Maybe your champion friend has used their Retributive Strike to take some of the damage off. Or maybe there's some other condition that reduces the damage that you take. So I can do that on the fly very easily by holding down Shift when I click any of these buttons. So if I hold down Shift while clicking damage, I can adjust the amount of damage or healing done. So say that 3 damage is blocked, I would say -3, and now I'm only taking 4 damage. The same thing I can do for healing. Maybe I have some feature that lets me get more healing than usual. I can add +3, and well, I already reached my max HP, but I would actually be healing for 10 in that instance. So this shift clicking allows you to modify this number here with whatever you might have need of. I'm going to do a quick aside about persistent damage. Now, in a lot of cases, when they come from a monster stat block or a spell, there will actually be draggable items you can drag from the card onto your character. For instance, in the Acid Splash cantrip, it's a great example. I can just drag 4 persistent acid damage onto the token, and now they're suddenly taking persistent damage. But in case, for whatever reason, the spell or effect that is affecting you does not automatically have it set up in a way to be draggable, you can very easily put persistent damage on yourself by right-clicking, going to our conditions manager, finding persistent damage, which is this drop over here. And when we click that, the system will prompt us for how much persistent damage and the DC for it, which is usually 15. And you can click this little save button to apply that persistent damage to yourself. The persistent damage, as I'll show you, if I end my turn, it automatically rolls at the end of your turn. The system hasn't yet got to the point where it's automatically going to prompt you for a flat check, the D20, to see if it is elapsed, but I wouldn't be surprised if that arrives within the next few weeks at most, because the system is moving very quickly in development. That seems like a feature that's going to be here anytime now. But for the moment, yes, I would need to roll a manual D20 to see if I recover. That's /R1D20. Look, I've recovered, so I can very easily remove the persistent damage by right-clicking the effect in the top right. All right, now before leaving behind attacking and damaging the basics of it, I also wanted to show you how to use hero points to re-roll a roll you didn't like, a roll that you want to do better on. So instead of going through your sheet, finding the roll that you did, for example, if I wanted to re-roll that arcane spell attack, scrolling up, finding Acid Splash and clicking attack again. Sure, I could do that. That takes a little bit more time. There's an easier way to do it. You can just right click the card that has the roll you want to re-roll, and there'll be an option saying re-roll using a hero point if you have a hero point available. So if I didn't have a hero point and I tried the same thing, you can see it isn't there. There isn't that option. There is, however, reroll and keep the new result or the worst result. These will actually come into mind. There's certain monsters and stuff who have abilities to make you reroll. So this can still be used for that. But the advantage of using this method to reroll using a hero point is when I do so, the hero point is automatically taken off. So I don't need to worry about remembering to do that. It is already taken care of. And continuing on how we can use chat cards, I wanted to talk to you about how you can use them to roll saving throws. So suppose an enemy caster had cast Fear on me. Now, for ease, I'm just using our own Fear spell, but I assure you, Samara is not masochistic. In any case, once this chat card is out into chat, I can select the token, and I can just click this little button here to roll a will save. This is great. Not only is it convenient, because you don't need to go back into your character sheet to find will save and roll it. But by doing this, the system recognizes the traits of the spell or effect that you're rolling against. And if you have certain bonuses or penalties that specifically apply to the traits of that spell, it will take that into account. This is actually a great example because you see the against emotion effects +1 is already taken into account here. If I just rolled a plain will save, I wouldn't see that bonus. But by linking it to this chat card, to this effect, which has its traits already programmed in, the system can be smart about it. It knows what bonuses to add. So this is a really great way of making sure you're not forgetting any bonuses or penalties that apply to specific effects. All right, now say that instead of attacking and all that kind of stuff, maybe we wanted to cast the spell Color Spray. So let's put that out into the chat. We've seen this before. Now you'll see that in addition to the will save, we're not going to be rolling for that. It's going to be the GM who's going to be selecting their tokens and clicking that button. And by the way, for the GM's benefit, you can select multiple tokens and have them all roll by clicking this button just once. But for our purposes, I want to talk about AoE templates. If I click this place 15-foot cone button, you can see that an AoE template is now attached to my mouse. And obviously, we don't want it to be any of the directions pointed out by default here. How do I rotate this template? It's very simple. I just hold down Control and I scroll with my mouse wheel. And that brings it all the way around and I can place it exactly as I would like, which is against this ghoulish creature. And if I later want to delete this AoE template, on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see there's this L-shaped ruler. I can go there, and once in that UI, you see this little burst icon. So firstly, this has some properties of the burst that you might find interesting. For instance, you can confirm the distance, you can change the angle very minutely. If you don't want to use a scroll wheel, or if you don't have a scroll wheel, this is another way you could adjust that angle. You can even change the border and fill color if you're feeling so inclined. But also, while your mouse is over this burst icon, you can just click delete and the template vanishes. All right, now I also wanted to show you how you can apply conditions to yourself without going into the conditions manager. So for instance, say we were affected by this fear, what we could do instead of right-clicking here, going to conditions and clicking frightened 2, instead of that, we could just drag the effect right from the chat card onto our token and it's already frightened 2. Very simple and easy. Now, some spells that you cast will have effects. And let's say that Samara is tired of fighting in the dark. She casts Dark Vision. And you can see there are these buttons in the Dark Vision spell, usually with the prefix spell effect. Those I can drag onto my token, and suddenly I have Dark Vision. And these effects are very powerful. Both the positive and negative ones are exactly what the spell says they are. So these can include anything from Inspire Courage to Bane to almost all the spell effects in the game have one of these buttons that you can drag, whether to yourself or the GM can drag onto one of their tokens. Of note, I should be clear, is that you cannot drag any effects onto a token you do not own. So for instance, if I was casting Bane, I couldn't drag spell effect Bane onto the ghoul. The GM would have to do that, but I can't do it for myself. Effects can also be even more easily applied. If there's an effect that you're finding that you're toggling on and off a lot, I think the most common example of this is Inspire Courage. What you can do is drag that effect from the chat card onto the macro bar. That will create a macro for it that will toggle the effect. So if I click that effect, it toggles off. Click it again and it toggles on. So I don't even need to drag it from the chat card. I don't need to have the chat card available in the scrolling here. It's just in my macro bar. So that is especially useful for things like Raise a Shield for marshals. There is an effect which gives you a bonus when you raise a shield. And if you're looking on where to find these effects, in the right-hand corner, you can go to the second icon from the right, Compendium Packs, and under the Items section, you should see a bunch of compendiums with things like effects. So The most common ones for us will be spell effects and equipment effects. For example, under equipment effects, if I type shield, there we go, raise a shield. And I can drag that straight from the compendium to the macro bar to create a macro, and then I can toggle it whenever I'm raising a shield or not. I also want to point out a small setting that you can use when you're rolling that might make things go quicker or allow you to add bonuses on the fly. So in the current version of Foundry, whenever you log into a fresh world, or whenever you log into a world for the first time, you're prompted with a dialog box that lets you choose how you want to treat your role dialog. And the role dialog essentially is this thing. So it used to be that by default, whenever you want to roll anything, this role dialog pops up. It tells you all of the modifiers that go into it, and it lets you do things like add bonuses or keep higher, keep lower, etc. So it used to be the default, but now the first time you log into a world, you can actually set up whether you want it to be the default, whether clicking on anything should always bring up the any role should always bring up this role dialog, or whether you want it to be that clicking on a role doesn't bring up the role dialog, it just rolls. And if you want the role dialog, you hold down shift while clicking a role to bring it up. So that's generally how I personally prefer to do it. I usually don't need to modify roles. It's quite rare. So I would rather it be quick, just one click roll. And if I need to modify something on the fly, I can hold down shift while I click on whatever the role is to bring up this dialog. The other thing to note, the handy shortcut, is regarding blind rolls. So Pathfinder has a bunch of secret rolls that the player makes, but the GM is the only one who sees the result of. So this is pretty hard to do in in-person play. Usually the GM just ends up rolling it completely. But in Pathfinder, the player can actually roll it using the blind GM roll setting, right? And there is a shortcut to do that in Pathfinder 2e. If I just hold down Control while I click on a skill or any roll really, for example, let's say religion, that makes it a blind roll. So just hold down Control while clicking any roll and you turn it into a blind roll. So in our first video, when discussing the Actions tab, I talked a little bit about action macros and why they're so useful to use. I mentioned things like shove, right? And I'm going to show you that even in combat, those are excellent to use. So let's say, no, not create new action, but let's say I want the shove action like before. I'll drag that to my sheet. And if while targeting my enemy, if I click this skill action button, it will compare it to the enemy's fortitude DC automatically. So that's another showcase of why targeting can be so important, because it'll actually already do that comparison for you without you making, an athletics roll, the GM looking at the DC, etc. And this will also take into account penalties or bonuses that specifically apply to shoving that might not apply to the athletic skill as a whole. So again, I strongly recommend that whenever you can, you use skill action buttons rather than the generic skills, because it tends to be more precise. It tends to be a safer bet because you won't forget specific bonuses or penalties. Now, for this tutorial as a whole, I've kept it a completely vanilla world and I'm not using any modules. But one of the strengths of Foundry VTT is that modules can make your life a whole lot easier. The Pathfinder 2e system is so robust that you don't really have many must-have modules at all. Fewer by the day, really, as the system incorporates good ideas into its source code. But there is one that I would recommend, and it's called PF2E Workbench. And it has a host of features that I'm not going to dwell on, but you can read on. But the main thing that it does that I really like is that it has an option to add these skill icon buttons as separate skill actions in this tab. So you don't need to kind of open up the shove action, then click this thing. There'll just be an option down here. So under athletics, to shove. It's like a one-click thing. It looks like a strike, basically. And for those actions that follow the multiple attack penalty, that have the attack trait, it will actually let you do, at a -5 and at a -10. It is a very, very convenient thing that speeds up combat a great deal. And I would greatly recommend that particular module for that reason. Okay, now I'm going to go a little bit away from the nitty-gritty of combat to show you some things that are just going to make your life a little bit easier and allow you some more customization in how you want to experience Foundry. So the rightmost button here is the game settings button. And a lot of the time, I think players don't really pay attention to this because it's kind of considered a GM thing. Like configure settings, you kind of assume, well, what power will I have? It turns out a fair amount of power. There are a number of settings that you can adjust that will take effect for you personally, that you might want or not want for your preferences. Things like pan to token speaker. You can set that up. So if you want to be alerted when someone says something, if you want your camera to move, you can toggle this on for yourself. There are things like left click to release objects. This is a very popular setting. It's otherwise, if I can demonstrate in regular Foundry, if I click around, I'm currently clicking, but I'm still selecting Samara. It doesn't deselect her. However, if this setting is on and I save changes, just a single left click off will deselect her. So in the base setting, you actually need to drag out to deselect, but here it's just a single left click that allows you to deselect. So small things like that make a quality of life difference for you. They can generally be found in the configure game settings tab. And if your GM has any modules, they will show up here and they will have their own settings that are player unique settings. So very popular modules, for instance, like Dice So Nice, that give you digital dice that roll across the screen. You can come here to customize what those dice are. And many modules have the ability for players to customize aspects of that module for their own playing experience. I also want to show you under configure controls, the keybinds. So we've talked a little bit about keybinds, about things like how to automatically roll a blind roll or things like waypoints and that kind of stuff. So all of that should be indicated right over here, and probably plenty of others as well. Currently, we just have the core bindings. Here again, I want to shout out a module that really expands what you can do with key bindings. If you are a master of efficiency, you want to get things done very quickly, and you find keys easier to use than a mouse clicking workflow, you want to look for PF2E Keybind Menagerie. That lets you assign keybinds to a whole bunch of stuff. Like, for instance, you can assign a keybind, so pressing the key F while selecting a token will increase their frightened value. It can go pretty minute. So it's definitely something to check out if you want to maximize your efficiency in that way. So we have been in combat for a bit now, and often in combat we are cycling between the chat message tab and the encounter tab. So we're seeing what is happening right now, the encounter tab to see maybe when is our turn, is it coming up, or who's next initiative, and that kind of thing. And if you prefer not to cycle between these two tabs, what you can do on any of these tabs actually is right click to pop them out into their own window. And I can do that for, as you can see, any of these directories for quick access. Now, most commonly it's done for the encounter tracker because the others you're not needing to refer to quite as rapidly. But this is just a neat little trick to have in your back pocket. Now, once the battle is done, and it really isn't done, but we're going to pretend it is. We're going to declare victory and leave like many of the greatest generals. Once the battle is done and the adventuring day is over and we go home, I want to show you a convenient way to reset all your resources without having to manually go through them, and that is this rest for the night button in the left-hand side of your character sheet. If you click that, it will restore all your spell slots, remove your temporary items, and it will restore an amount of HP that is appropriate to your constitution modifier and that kind of thing. How many ever HP you're supposed to recover when you rest without being treated. Alright, well that is pretty much all that I'd wanted to share about playing in the Pathfinder 2e system on Foundry VTT. I hope that that's given you a bit of a clearer idea about what the system is capable of and how it can help to smooth the running of combat and exploration and generally make your life easier while playing this game. So that's it for this video. I hope to come up with some other videos in not too long, but as the topics of that, I'm still kind of deciding. So for now, it is adieu, and thank you for listening.